Boxcars and Bravery by Frances Calais. Carolyn and her boyfriend had been dating since September 14th. They met on the second day of school, the sixth grade, in a new building for not quite middle schoolers. They happened to get lost in the same stairwell and found not their classrooms but each other. They didn't kiss, they didn't talk. They pointed one another in any direction that seemed right. And Carolyn sweated through her t-shirt. He was cute. He was nervous. They were both late. They didn't start dating right away, but after discovering that they had the same lunch period, and after spending those 25 minutes smiling at one another in line for bad pizza every day for 2 weeks, Carolyn decided they ought to try themselves out as a couple. She approached him in the cafeteria and asked if he wanted to sit down, and Brian, that was his name, led her to his usual section with his usual friends, and that was that. He held her hand under the table, and she blended in with his group seamlessly. The following week, she introduced him to her pals, and that was that. Over soggy tater tots, a romance was born. Now, it was late October, and that pleasantly easy period at the beginning of the fall semester, when everyone is still getting used to being back at school, was over. Brian and Carolyn had spent September lazily working on homework assignments side by side, but now things were getting harder. Now, during study sessions, they were less chatty and more studious. After school, they took separate buses home, but their developments weren't that far away from one another, so they take turns riding their bicycles to the other person's house to do work. Carolyn's parents were divorced, and her mom was always at work when she got home from school, but the babysitter played Led Zeppelin and made homemade lemonade and stayed out of the way. Brian's parents worked, too, but his grandmother lived in the suite above his garage, and she always had chocolate chip cookies waiting when Carolyn came over. Today was Tuesday, and it was Carolyn's turn to ride to Brian's. Her bike was a red mountain bike, and it was a little too small, but it was comfortable for a mile or two, which is all it took to get to Brian's and back. She always leaned it against the front of the garage behind the house. He always just let his fall into the grass in her front lawn. "Hey, Brian," she called out as she pushed open the back door to the house. "In here," he called out from the living room. It sounded like his mouth was full. Carolyn kicked her shoes off and wandered into the den. She threw her backpack on the ground next to Brian. "Quit being lazy," she said, and stepped on his leg as he lay on his belly staring at the TV, his book stacked lamely beside him. Their relationship was a quiet one. They were only 11, and so dating meant mostly being best friends and holding hands, although Brian had gotten up the nerve to kiss Carolyn in the school bus lot after school once, hidden from others in a cloud of exhaust. It had been quick. They'd both coughed. Carolyn's parents had divorced when she was 9, and while her father still lived in the city, he was on the opposite end of town. The split hadn't been pretty, so she didn't see him as much as she wanted. She was lonely sometimes, but hadn't lost any friends. She chalked the loneliness up to being without a dad, and acted out her anger by making what her therapist called reckless decisions. They were exciting decisions, though, and while she knew she ought to cut it out, she always felt for a moment like she was in control of her life. No one else could own her reckless decisions but her. Brian's life was calmer than Carolyn's. His parents both worked long hours, though, so he knew what it felt like to be lonesome. His grandma was great, but even she had a life outside of the house, so Brian often felt like his world was limited to the orbit of school and home, 2 buildings with no one inside them but himself. Meeting Carolyn made him feel less like an outsider, because even with his friends at school, he felt like an invisible wall had kept him from really knowing anyone. Carolyn had punched that wall down somehow and extended her hand. "Okay," Carolyn exhaled loudly and flopped onto her back. "Now I'm bored." "Me too," said Brian, but he reached for his math workbook. "No, put that down," said Carolyn. She sat up. "I need a break. Can we please take a break?" Sure. What do you want to do?" "Ride bikes. Let's go somewhere." Carolyn thought for a minute. I want to explore. Okay, where do you want to explore? Brian asked. I don't know. Let's just go. That's the fun of it. Carolyn grabbed Brian's hand and pulled him up. He made a quick survey of the mess of papers and books on the floor and then hopped along as Carolyn tugged him to the door. Let's bike to some of those warehouses. They have big parking lots and we can do tricks, Brian offered. He couldn't actually do anything exciting, but he liked to try. Sure, yes. Carolyn pushed off on her bike and headed down the driveway. Brian followed, and they turned onto the street. It wasn't a long way to the industrial park. The nearest one took Brian and Carolyn just 10 minutes to get to, and it did indeed offer several open lots for riding. Cars mostly parked in the lot closest to the office building, which left lots near the outer building empty for play. They rode in circles and figure eights, and they picked up long branches from underneath the few trees along the edges of the buildings and played like medieval jousters. Carolyn stopped for a moment to stare at the sky, and Brian took the opportunity to poke her in the side. She threw down her bike and tackled him. What was that for? Brian laughed as he fell over. His bike landed on the top of his legs, and Carolyn landed on top of his bike. You took advantage of me not paying attention, Carolyn countered. She laughed too, and when she stood up, she helped pick up the toppled bikes. I'm bored here. She could see the train yard from where they were, just behind the warehouse building and over the creek, festered with shrubs. Let's go check out some trains. Yeah? Brian tested her. He was nervous about going to the tracks, although he'd done so once before. He'd wanted to leave pennies on the tracks so that after a train passed, they'd be flat and smooth tokens of his bravery, but he'd been frightened both of being run over himself and of causing the trains to jump the rails and end up deadly runaways. Sure, if you think it's a good idea. It's fine. I'm not talking about riding them. They're never moving through the yards very fast anyway. Mostly they're just sitting there. Train yards are for lazy trains. Carolyn was already pedaling towards the creek. They found a spot that wasn't too overgrown with vines and bushes and pushed their bikes through the water. It wasn't deep and it wasn't moving. It was too cold now for frogs to be out, but Brian looked anyway. Carolyn called up for him and she set her bike down on the grass before the first set of tracks. Looking left and right across the yard, checking for people and moving trains, Carolyn stepped into the gravel. She picked up a handful and threw it, piece by piece, across the tracks. Come on, she urged, and Brian followed. There was no one around. A few lonely coal cars sat to their left, unattached to any engine. The only long train was at the far end of the yard in front of them, and it wasn't moving. It wasn't even making noise. Carolyn pointed at it. I'm going to check it out. The graffiti on the side of the boxcars was interesting. It was colorful and some of it was beautiful, although most of it was unreadable or profane. Brian flipped the hood of his sweatshirt up and followed her. She was pretty, he thought, and braver than he was, and the combination made him nervous. It also made him very glad that she was on his side. When they reached the train, they just stood there, both of them in awe of how big it actually was. I'm nervous, Carolyn admitted, staring into the mouth of an open boxcar. She unbuttoned her jacket but left it on, and she tied her hair back, and she reached up for the bottom rung on the ladder that was welded to the side of the car. You're crazy, Brian said, but inside he was